So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and get our presentation of the day started. So Ann Hallam, come on up. So Ann is a longtime board member of the Texas Energy Council. She works at Providence, and she's quite frankly one of my good friends and one of the long-standing board members. She's going to have a chance to introduce our opening speaker. Ann, take it away.
Good morning. I'm pleased to tell you about Tim Dove, our first speaker this morning. Tim serves as President and Chief Operating Officer of Pioneer Natural Resources since 2004. He's also President and Chief Operating Officer at Pioneer Southwest Energy Partners, LP. From 2000 to 2004, Mr. Dove served as Chief Financial Officer, Executive Vice President, and Assistant Secretary of Pioneer Natural Resources Company. And from 1997, he served as Executive Vice President of Business Development at Pioneer Natural Resources. Mr. Dove joined Parker & Parsley in 1994 as Vice President International. Prior to this, he was with Diamond Shamrock and its successor, Maxis Energy Corp., in various capacities in international exploration and production, marketing, refining, planning, and development. He has been Director of Pioneer Natural Resources since 2013. He earned a Bachelor of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering from MIT and an MBA from the University of Chicago in 1981. Please help me welcome Tim Dove.
Thank you very much, Ann, and thank you too, Jason. I'm really impressed by the information that he presented regarding the ability for this organization to provide scholarships for young people coming into the industry and/or for those trying to advance their education, because we do have a graying industry. As for me, I've gone to platinum blonde versus gray, but the fact is, as an organization, we have a bit of a barbell effect going on. We have young people coming in, we have elderly statesmen who are retiring, and so bringing new blood and new educated folks into the industry is a huge positive. So I congratulate the council for their efforts over many years in doing just that. What I want to do is a little bit what Jason mentioned, which is to give you an update from the industry itself as to what's going on in regard to a couple of things. One is the current situation we're in and how we're responding to this downturn in commodity prices, as well as to talk a little bit about how we're responding to that. And then also, one of our topics dear to heart is this notion of trying to get the export ban lifted in the United States when it comes to crude oil. So I'll hopefully cover some of those topics. Maybe I'll leave a few minutes at the end for Q&A. The first graph I have here shows where Pioneer sits in the industry. You can see here that we're one of the larger players, needless to say, in the Permian Basin, but importantly, we have significant interest in both the Permian and the Eagle Ford. So we speak with a decent amount of authority to say we're in 2 of the 3 big basins in the United States that are growing. So that would be Bakken, Eagle Ford, and the Permian Basin. Actually, in the case of Bakken and Eagle Ford Shale, they're starting to slightly decline, turn over, just because of the rig count declines that we've seen, which have been so dramatic. But the company is in good position, I think, with regard to these basins being some of the really key growth basins. I'd point you to the top right of this graph, which shows the rig count drops that have occurred. So what it shows you, for example, in the Midland Basin where Pioneer operates, we had 328 total rigs running, and now we have 126. So there is no major basin in the United States that has not seen a fall in rigs any less than about 50%. In some cases, 70%. Vertical drilling in the Midland Basin and the Permian Basin is essentially going away. I think there were 380 rigs running at the peak in 2012 in the Permian Basin drilling vertical wells, and now there are 59, to give you an example. And so vertical drilling by definition is in more difficult straits just because they're not as prolific wells as horizontal wells. All that said, they'll come back if and when we get improvements in commodity prices. And those basins are shown here for all of y'all who are not as familiar with what I was talking about as to where the growth areas are. The big 3 really, of course, are the Bakken and the Eagle Ford and the Permian. Some other areas have seen growth, both in the Niobrara, for example, in the Rockies, Scoop play, and so on. But the big 3 plays, when you look at really incrementally adding production to the country and to the country's reserve base, are these 3. And Permian stands out. as really the asset, the resource base that's going to be here for decades. If you look at it on a relative basis, the amount of shale rock in place in the Permian Basin is shocking relative to the rest of these plays. We're in the Eagle Ford, so we like the Eagle Ford very much. What these columns show are essentially logs of the different stratigraphic components of these plays, and I would point you to Eagle Ford here and show you that as much as we like Eagle Ford, there's 300 feet of shale, and it's an outstanding asset. But if you look at the Permian Basin, all of these red areas are intended to designate pay in the shales. And so you can see we have, rather than 300 feet of shale, something like 4,500 feet of shale, or 4,000 feet of shale, depending upon where you are. So it has a tremendous advantage in terms of opportunity, and the immensity of it is somewhat shocking. When people see this, they start to understand why the numbers are where they are in terms of the resource potential in this basin. But it has another distinct advantage, and that is its aerial extent. So in the case of the Midland Basin, if you look at a map, it runs about 150 miles north-south and about 75 miles east-west. So it calculates to have about 7% larger area than the state of Massachusetts. This is just the Midland Basin I'm talking about. And so not only do you have this massive shale rock volume in the sense of 4,000 feet below the surface, but you also have a massive aerial extent at the surface. So the 3D, basically shale rock volumes are immense, and that's why we're going to be drilling wells in this basin ourselves and our successors and other companies for decades to come. And this is going to be the linchpin for growth as we look forward in terms of many decades of drilling. And what it amounts to now, because of those factors I mentioned, that is to say a combination of depth and also aerial extent, in other words 3D volume of shale, we now can say that the Spraberry Wolfcamp is the largest field in the United States, 75 billion barrel potential in terms of resources. And it somewhat dwarfs some of these other big plays, having grown themselves. But that's why we're excited about what the Permian can do going forward in terms of adding resources to the country. It's just really in its infancy, though, in terms of drilling. This play, the horizontal play per se in the Permian Basin just began roughly 2011 or so. So it's only 3 or 4 years old. And you can see here the black line showing how the effect of drilling then has led to production growth. So very similar to what you see in the orange, which is Eagle Ford, having now been in production phase for 6 or 7 years, and the Bakken much longer, shown in the green. But what's going to happen, assuming we get some kind of reasonable turnaround on the margins of drilling, is this black line is going to keep going up where you see the others flattening out. And that's owing to what I mentioned, which is to say that immense resource potential. This is just our share of it. This is what's happened to our production when it comes to this West Texas area. You can see a couple, 2, 3 years ago, we were 137,000 barrels a day. We'll be at 200 here in the third quarter, roughly. And a lot of that's oil, needless to say. And these wells we're drilling in the Permian Basin, they will be anywhere between 70 and 80% oil. So we're not dealing with a lot of natural gas and NGLs, which are today stricken with the low commodity price disease. And so I think oil will always be benefiting the economics in that sense. But we think we can continue to grow on this trajectory, again, predicated on whether we have cooperative oil prices. And so what I'm turning to now is more of a macro look, or let me just say a world look at what's really been going on. And if you take a look at this chart, you would see that the total world production, now looking back on the last 6 years, has grown some 2.5 million barrels a day. That's shown in the red bar. But the concept here, if you take a look at it, is that the rest of the world, other than the United States, has basically been down 1 million barrels a day. During almost all of this time period, particularly after 2009, we've had $90 to $100 oil, which goes to show you the rest of the world is having a hard time growing their production, even in a strong commodity price environment. Where in the United States, at $90 to $100 oil, we've knocked it out of the park. You can see our production up 3.5 million barrels a day. Most of that's coming from the state of Texas, obviously, in terms of percentages. And so when you start looking forward and you're saying, what does that mean? It means that the United States shale producers still will be the swing producers, basically. And that's what we're seeing in today's market, of course. It's essentially the role the Saudis would like to put us in. But that's where we've been, actually, since 2008, if you consider the fact the rest of the world has not been adding production. Here you can see the impact of the revolution, if you want to call it that, when it comes to U.S. and Texas shales. It's very easy to see. When you just take a look at what is here, decades of production, the black line showing the United States production and the Texas production. So Texas up 2.5 million barrels a day from where it had been back in about 2009, and the United States have about 3.5. So Texas is taking its heavy share of this incremental growth out of particularly the Permian and the Eagle Ford. And then what does that mean going forward? Well, it means the United States has vaulted some other countries from the standpoint of where it is in terms of contributions of total energy supply. Heading from 2008 to 2014, the blue bars are representing the United States, and you can see the United States is today the world's largest energy producer. Interestingly, though, if you take a look at the Saudis here, shown in the red, their numbers are up slightly, but they're essentially flat in the sense of compared to what the United States has done. And you can see what in essence has happened is the United States taking market share away from the Saudis in the total energy picture of significance. And that's why we find ourselves today in a situation where we're sort of battling it out for market share. The thing about it is the shale plays can move fast. We can move rigs up and down very quickly, and I'll show you a graph on that. And so we can be an adequate swing producer, but ultimately we do need constructive oil and gas prices to move ahead on production growth. And what's happened, though, as a result of all this growth is a pretty significant issue when it comes to our ability to process all the oil we're now incrementally producing. And one of the effects of that, when we're limited in our ability to economically process all of the internal domestic crude oil, is a rise in inventories. So what you see here is in the blue, the inventory of, this is total U.S. inventory of crude oil, dramatically increasing up to record levels and completely out of the 5-year ranges. This is because we are producing quite a large amount of light sweet crude oil, and there's only a limited amount of it that basically can be processed economically. The refiners would tell you, and I think it's true, they could refine every single barrel. The issue is at what price. They would have to discount it compared to some of the heavy crudes they're bringing in. And so what's happened here is a significant rise in inventories, which has had the effect, as you might guess, of putting a cap on pricing. And this is similar, but just focusing on Cushing, this gets a lot of press. You can see Cushing is up near its peak in terms of what it actually can store. And so this is an issue going forward we have to resolve. You do see United States demand increasing now for crude oil, just as a result of the fact we've had low prices, which is establishing the opportunity for more demand. And here you see a graph showing essentially what amounts to the decline in importation of oils. So this we can point to and say, this is phenomenal, that we've been able to actually reduce imports so significantly to the point where in the blue we're not really importing any light sweet crude. That's what we produce here in the United States. And we've even reduced, to some extent, some medium crudes. Heavy crudes are the standard by which the refining business has been built in the Gulf Coast, which is to say, using United States technology to take heavy sour barrels, convert them into high-quality transportation fuels, and doing so make a significant margin by having done so. That said, the oil we're producing doesn't fit that model, and therein lies the rub in terms of the need for exports. Here you can kind of see a similar notion. The only thing I'd add here is you see crude oil imports coming down, oil production going up. That's what we've already covered. But the other thing to note is our exports of refined products have gone up dramatically. We're now easily over 3 million barrels a day, maybe 3.5, approaching 4 million barrels a day. So we're in this situation where, although we're restricted as to what we can export, on the one hand, 4 million or 3.5 million barrels a day of gasoline, diesel fuel, and so on are being exported. So the beneficiaries today are the refiners, because they can take the discounted oils that we're producing and discounted simply because of the inventory builds and inability to run all those oils efficiently and economically, taking those and converting them into exportable products, and those exportable products are tied to Brent prices because the product market, gasoline and so on, is really an international market. It's not a U.S. market per se as to where the prices are set. And what you see then is a blowout in terms of the historical relationships between Brent and WTI, as you might expect. And you can see the actual differential here in the top. Over the last few years, we've seen it blow out to $20 to $30 a barrel, which is sort of shocking. Now it's down to more roughly about $7 a barrel. But this is still quite a large amount of money left on the table for the U.S. producers. And we're in a $60 oil world. If we could get $6 more on our pricing, I'll show you the impact of it in the slide, but it's dramatic. You're getting 10% more revenue, and that goes straight to the bottom line in terms of our returns and our margins. And so it's putting us essentially in a disadvantaged position to have a situation in which we're forced to cram light sweet crude oil into refineries that don't really need it in terms of how they're configured, and at the same time then not be able to export the balance. So if you think about the right trade for the United States is to export our light sweet crude oils into those markets, and most international markets have light sweet crude oil refineries because they're focused on making transportation fuels, and export our volumes there at a high value, take in heavy sour crudes at a low value, and make the margin there, and then that's the right trade for the country. And so that's why this export business becomes important. Notwithstanding that, the extra $6 or $7 and more at times that we're leaving on the table could actually add a lot of jobs to the industry, because you'd have much more activity if you get $5, $10, $15 more dollars per barrel on the basis of WTI. And so here, for example, we show, this is just from press clippings, we've lost, this is 100,000 jobs, I think it's 120 today, maybe 130,000 jobs already, and you can see how fast that happens. This is out of the service companies and the upstream companies like ourselves. So this is a pretty dramatic impact here, and on the basis, and particularly in light of the fact that from a historical standpoint, the oil and gas business was contributing most of the new jobs that has led to relatively lower unemployment. So this is a big issue for the country. And at the same time, because we've now brought the rig count down, you start to see weekly production, this is total U.S. oil production, sort of flattening and then starting to decline. Now that's a good thing in the sense that it can then balance the oil and gas, or especially the oil situation when it comes to supply, bringing down supply. I said demand is taking off somewhat. We can get a situation where the curves cross again. But the fact is, this lower production is indicative of also less rig utilization and more unemployment in our area. This is probably the most important slide in this deck, and I can't go through it in detail because half of you can't see it where they're in the back, but what these colors are suggesting is various prices for crude oil. And this is an important study that's been done by PIRA to show how much more incremental oil comes at different oil prices. And so the way to think about this is, it shows in this magenta color, if we're at a $60 to $70 case, we can have some growth into this early part of this, or latter part of this decade, but then it flattens out. And then what you really see is in a 70 to 80 case, which is the light blue, you actually can have significant growth in the country for a number of years. At 80 to 90, which is going to be shown in the second of the two dark blue areas, we're growing dramatically into for the next 10 to 15 years. And so this is really going to be the question we have to address is, where will the spot price settle out so as to allow more drilling and growth in the United States, considering the United States shale production is going to be needed to meet world demand. And so the question is, where does it settle out? I think internally we would look at 70 to 80 to be a case where we could actually grow production. In fact, we're looking at adding more rigs today as a result of improvement in commodity prices we've seen, with low 60s oil prices. You couple that with a situation in which we're able to go to our service providers and get some cost reductions, as well as improve our own internal efficiencies and productivity in the downturn, and we feel like we can get back to a more accelerated drilling campaign. In other words, it's a margin business, and so we have to not only realize that commodity prices have to contribute constructively, but at the same time, we need our costs to come in line as well as improve as a company and as an industry. And so what the Saudis are doing, maybe unintentionally, is forcing companies like ourselves to reduce our break-even costs. So I don't think that works well for them for the long term, but that's exactly what's going on. One thing we have been successful at as a company is exporting Eagle Ford shale condensate. Now, a lot of people would say, well, the the United States authorized, or the Commerce Department authorized the sale of this internationally. It's technically not true. There were guidelines when it comes to processed materials that already promulgated rules and regulations, and it just so happens this condensate in the Eagle Ford has to be processed to stabilize it, and its processing qualified as enough processing such that it came under the category of processed fuels and could be exported. And so this is not akin to saying that the export ban has been lifted. It's just these volumes are being exported under the existing legislation. But we've been very successful. I think we've got 20,000 barrels a day going out in international markets today. We're going to add more going into the third quarter and fourth quarter and some of it. We'd like to get to the point where we can export all of our volume. And this is kind of a poster child. If we were to sell this condensate into the United States markets where this is very high API gravity material, maybe 60-degree gravity or more, we could possibly be looking at a $12 to $13 discount when it comes to WTI. If we export this oil and do the net back calculations, we end up in the mid-single digits. So this is back to regaining that $6 or $7 that I mentioned earlier, and it certainly improves the economics of drilling these wells that are high in condensate value. So I think if anybody's had a chance to think it through, if you haven't used, there's a lot of people who have in various think tanks around the United States about the benefit of eliminating this export ban. Realizing it was put in place in the early 1970s or mid-1970s in response to a completely different situation. It was put in place in response to the desire to have price controls when, and the only way to have price controls that work, of course, is to not allow people to export oil to other countries where the price is higher. And that's why the export bans were put in. Well, today we're in a situation we have excess oil, and the result of that is the need and the surplus I've showed you in inventories require that this oil needs to be moved elsewhere. And what we've already shown is our ability to reduce imports. Imports now are only about 30% of our utilization. It was as high as 80% or 70% in terms of crude oil imports. And it allows the benefits of this trade I mentioned that really makes sense from an economic standpoint. And so I think from anyone's view who can do the calculations on this oil coming into the market, relatively sweet oil, will lower worldwide gasoline prices, can lower United States gasoline prices. The problem is, on both sides of the aisle, is they're definitely afraid of a situation where gasoline prices go up for some reason, and they're blamed for it, and they get kicked out of office. There's your issue right there. And so we're having to do quite a bit of education, and there are a lot of other people helping us do that, which amounts to making sure everybody understands the benefit of this. I look at it simply to say, here we are in a major brouhaha discussing sanctions regarding Iran and their potential proliferation of nuclear warfare weaponry. And here we have sanctions on ourselves, on our own crude oil. That doesn't make any sense, obviously. It would make much more sense if we had sanctions on Iran to have no sanctions here and be able to fill the world markets with U.S. oil in response to that. And so a lot of people would say, well, those are two separate issues, and I know they're two separate issues, but they're related is the point. And I think we would do well in terms of the impact around the country from the standpoint of eliminating this export ban. This is some statistics on that. Number of increase in jobs, 750 billion of incremental surplus. I mean, the numbers jump off the page because if we're in a situation where, in fact, gasoline prices are lower, not only the lower fuel prices give basically a stimulus to the economy, the government revenues increase as we increase gross production out of the industry and GDP as a result. There is really no case for not allowing this to occur. And this is my last slide. It's kind of a way to put your arms around where this decision resides and the importance of it. Actually, it's the other side of that. It shows the ridiculousness of the current export policy. So there are three things on the Export Administration regulations that are called on the short supply control list. One of them is crude oil. You can see the crude oil barrel there. The second is unprocessed Western red cedar. Okay, what that, of course, is doing is protecting everyone who is in a lumber yard on the West Coast processing Western red cedar, because you can't export processed red cedar. And then similarly, ridiculousness, horses exported by sea. And that had to do with issues with a lot of horses being moved over into Eastern Europe and used for foodstuffs and so on. And Of course, the United States is limited to what we can export horses at sea, but we can move them through Mexico and Canada, no problem. So again, it doesn't make any sense. So when I look at crude oil being on the same list, I kind of shake my head and go, we've got to do something about this. So I would ask all of you all with your constituents, realize the importance of this for the industry, for the country, and mention it when you're in the right situations with the right people to say this is something we need to change and that we should change. And the faster the better to get the industry back on its feet and drilling more wells and putting people back to work. So I want to thank the council for having me, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak in front of all you all. And my time is up, but I really appreciate the opportunity to have been here. Thanks very much.